Hey YouTube, Hickory Stick back with you again. I want to let's talk about some brass, a subject that is normally near and dear to all our hearts. All of my brass was getting pretty wore. My 22-250 brass and my 30-06 brass, the primer pockets were just about gone in them. The 4570, we only had 18 pieces of brass for it to begin with. That's all I had. All of that brass was getting old too. I wasn't seeing loose primer pockets in it, but with only 18 pieces, that's kind of hard to do any load development with. I went out for the 4570 and I bought 50 pieces of Starline. Upon initial looking at it, I think it's good stuff. This is great stuff. It is nice and heavy. The case walls seem to be nice and thick. The primer pockets are nice and tight. And I think it's going to be good stuff. I don't shoot enough 4570 to warrant spending the money to buy a bulk buy on brass. These 50 pieces of brass for the 4570 will probably last me 2 years. Simply because of the fact that it's expensive to load it and shoot it due to the amount of lead that each bullet has. We're shooting 300, 325 grain, 350 grain, even 400 grain bullets. Those are expensive bullets. Therefore, I cannot spend the money, as much money on those to buy those bullets because my money doesn't go as far. So 50 pieces of brass will last me a long time. Well, that leads me to 30-06 and 22-250. Desperately needed some brass in those. And since the 4570 Starline brass was so nice, I decided, you know what? Starline has started making 30-06 brass. So I went out and bought 250 pieces of Starline 30-06 brass in bulk. Now the reason why I've got them set out like this is because I decided for once in my life to sit down and sort some brass. So I sorted out all of the Starline brass that I had. And I tried to sort it in 2 grain increments. To be honest with you, I couldn't go in 2 grain increments. I had to drop down to 0.3 grain increments because the stuff was pretty good as far as weight goes. It was real close. The average weight of 250 pieces of brass was 187.68. The extreme spread was 187.68 minus 1.48 plus 1.32 for a 2.8 grain spread. Standard deviation was 0.91 on the weight of this brass. I thought that was pretty good for 250 pieces of brass, especially for what I paid for this stuff. 250 pieces of this brass was $108 shipped. A 2.8 grain spread over 250 pieces for $108? Man, you can't beat that in my book. I'm very pleased with that. This brass is going to last a long time for me. Then there came the 22-250. That was another one that I desperately needed some brass for. Well, Starline doesn't make brass for 22-250. I wish they did, but they do not. For whatever reason, they're not making that brass. That being said, I still had several options of brass for the gun. Winchester makes brass for it. Hornady makes brass for it. Norma makes brass for it. Nosler has brass for it, which, as I understand, Nosler is thought to be just pre-sorted Norma. I don't know. I've never really thoroughly researched that. Several companies made brass for it, along with Lapua. So, your boy here went out and spent the money and bought 100 pieces of Lapua brass because I wanted some good brass for the 22-250. I have already used Remington once fired that I got out of Remington, the cheap Remington boxes. I've used Winchester brass, and neither of those held up very well. They weren't particularly bad brass. They just did not hold up well. The primer pockets I have had no trouble with case neck splitting, no trouble with case splitting, no trouble with case head separation on any of the brass. But the primer pockets wear out at what I feel like is a pretty quick rate. 7 to 8 shots, my primer pockets are gone. I have heard that Lapua has really nice, really good primer pockets, and that their heads are harder than the other brands, specifically Winchester and Remington. The bad part about Lapua brass is it's stupid expensive. Well, I guess I shouldn't say that. The Norma was just as much, but the Lapua brass was really high. This 100 pieces of brass was $99. That's high, man. Especially when I just the same week bought 250 pieces of 30-06 brass for $108. But I got the brass in, and it's as expected with Lapua. It is really nice stuff. It came to me pre-polished. It came to me annealed, which I already knew that Lapua annealed their brass. It came with a chamfer and a mild deburr on the case mouth. It came with really clean flash holes. But what I will say about this stuff is that I was not impressed with the case mounts. The cases were all roughly the same length. They were very close in length. I did measure them. They were all within 1.5 thousandths of each other, basically. Had a few outliers, which is to be expected. The case mounts, they were just, to my notion, they weren't any better than any other brand of brass. I was under the impression, and I may have been under the wrong impression, but I was under the impression that Lapua was prepped, ready to fire. And like I said, that may have been the wrong impression, but that was the impression I got. These case mounts are ugly. They're not really square, and they are kind of around them. They're kind of beat up and banged up. Now, I don't know if that's from them jumbling around in the packaging. I don't know if that's from them jumbling around while they're being shipped or what. All of them were slightly less than or right at trim length. I took 50 pieces and I prepped them. I prepped them the way I want them prepped when I shoot. That meant I picked out the shortest one, which was, if I remember, it was about 0.5 thousandth less than trim length. And I cut 0.5 thousandth off of that. Then I trimmed all the rest of them to the same length. So all of these cases are about a thousandth below trim length. I made sure I trimmed them nice and square. All of them got that ugly, beat up cut face cut off of them. And then I re-chamfered and re-deburred the case mounts. I checked the flash holes while I was at it, but all of the flash holes were beautiful. There was no burrs or anything like that on any of the flash holes. The annealing job is beautiful on them. I love it. It is quite pretty. So I decided, you know what, I'm going to polish up a piece of each of these brass, just to see what the external visible quality of these three brasses. Now, the Starline, if they annealed it, they polished it off of there, because there's no evidence on any of these that I can see of annealing. I don't expect they annealed them, not for this cheap of brass. Now, looking at the difference between these three pieces of brass, the Lapua is a much smoother, much more finely finished piece of brass than the Starline. You may never be able to tell it, but looking at them, If you can see on this 4570 brass, you see it's a little bit of a rough texture. Same thing on this 30-06, but the Lapua, there's no rough texture there at all. So that's the major difference that I see between them as far as external visible differences. The Lapua is a smoother, more refined finish than the Starline. That's not saying the Starline isn't a nice finish. It's a nice, smooth, sparkly finish when you put a little polish on it. It's just not as refined as the Lapua. Aside from the smoother finish and the annealing, the only real difference that I can see between these two brands of brass is the primer pockets. The Starline, by all means, has nice tight primer pockets, but the primer pockets of the Starline are not consistent in their tightness. They're all tight. They all feel nice and tight. There's not a bad primer pocket in them that I have felt, but they're not consistent in their tightness. One of them may not be quite as tight as the next one. That's the thing that I see. In my mind, that's what really is will set these two brands apart. Surface finish, you know what? That's aesthetics. Annealing, it's nice to have them anneal from the factory, but we could anneal them ourselves. But the primer pockets tell the tale. And that's where the Lapua is winning in initial quality assessment. These primer pockets in this Lapua brass are beautiful. I've always heard they have good primer pockets. Every one is consistent. They are consistently tight. They are really nice and tight. Not overly tight, where it's hard, where it's hard to seat a primer and you're worried you're deforming primers that are seating. But they are nice and tight. Best primer pockets I have ever felt. And that's what is setting them apart above the Starline. But this is $100 for 100 pieces of brass. $1 a piece. This is $100 for 250 pieces of brass. That's a good price. I wish Starline made $22,250. If Starline had made $22,250 brass, we wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation right now. Because I'd have bought Starline, I bought 250 pieces of Starline $22,250 and 250 pieces of Starline 30-06. So if anybody from Starline happens to see this obscure video out there on YouTube that this old redneck has put out, y'all make some $22,250 brass. When I have wore these out, I'm going to make a results video as to which one lasted the best, which one performed the best for us. But for now, I just wanted to do this little video and discuss what I see on this brass. So until next time, y'all have a good one.